So, there was a bit of a gap between the Attack on Titan video that I uploaded and the whatever it was before that, about 3 months or so, and it's my intention to not have massive gaps between videos like that, if I can help it. So, while I was making the Attack on Titan video, doing the edits and stuff, I was obviously watching other shows and had thoughts on them naturally. So this is kind of a more casual approach. I'm not scripting anything. This is just thoughts on what I've been watching over the last 6 weeks or so, a month to 6 weeks. And spoiler warning for the shows on screen now. And there'll be timestamps in the description if you want to skip to a certain show that you're familiar with, or if you just want to hear me ramble about stuff, then you're more than welcome to stick around for the full thing. So the first show that I want to talk about is, ironically, two shows that I don't want to talk about, which is a weird way to start this video, but it's Owl House and Amphibia. Both these shows approaching the end of their runs. Amphibia has concluded with its third season. The Owl House has its season 2 wrapped up, but has 3, I think, double-length specials to finish out its story. And what I'm going to say about both shows is that they're good. They're good TV. They're damn good cartoons. But I don't want to talk too much about them because I have plans to do a bit more of an in-depth look at these shows, as I feel like them coming to the end is sort of like the end of a particular era of cartoons that I want to maybe do a retrospective of or look back on. For Amphibia, I think the third season you can kind of split down the middle, with the first half being set in Los Angeles and the second half being this final climactic battle against King Andreas. And while I feel that the second half is stronger, the first half is still very necessary. It's not like it's just filler. It's doing a lot of the building and setup in terms of flipping the show's concept on its head by having the planters in LA, establishing how the two worlds can be traversed with the portals, establishing a bunch of characters who will be coming back to help the heroes in the final battle. And as much as that is necessary to where the show is going, even during those Los Angeles episodes, I was more interested in the odd segment where they flipped back and said, what's Sasha and Grimes doing? What's happening with Yunan and Olivia? What's happening with Marcy being like cryo-frozen? I kind of found those more interesting. So when the second half of the season rolls around and they are more focused on that and there's more urgency, more continuity, it really does a great job of like building up to that final conflict with the heroes and King Andreas and Sasha and Marcy and Anne all sort of like getting back together and working as a team. So yeah, I don't want to go into the specifics of this or the Owl House season 2, which I'm honestly sort of catching up on as I'm recording this, because I want to do more of a deep dive into those shows in something separate. So moving on, Stranger Things season 4. Stranger Things is back, and it's not just back, but it's as good as it's been since season 1. I love that first season. I love the vibe, I love the setting, I love the characters, I love the grittiness of it, which I think is sort of not really talked about given the show's trajectory over seasons 2 and 3, where it's gotten more campy and gotten a bit more silly and doesn't take itself as seriously. But I really like that about season 1, that there was things like Will and Jonathan's dad, who was an alcoholic drunk. You got more about Hopper's backstory with the kid that he lost. You had Barb's death and the whole tragedy of that. I'd forgotten that there was a sex scene between Steve and Nancy. So the first season was a lot darker and grittier than the show got in the following 2 seasons, and I kind of thought that season 1 of Stranger Things could have wrapped up nicely and worked as an anthology, where the lingering questions about the Upside Down and Brenner's Lab could have been explored by a different group of characters. I thought that's where the show should have gone, but obviously it didn't. It went into season 2, and in season 2 it sort of paradoxically felt safer, even though they were obviously trying to experiment with things. You had the backlash to 11 going into the city and meeting the other superpowered kids. People really hated that, but then they praised the show for basically covering the same ground and the same story beats as the first season, which I think leading into season 3, where they kind of doubled down on that response that they got to season 2, where they just went all in on the campy, hammy 1980s stuff. And like, the show's always been a bit camp, and the show's always had sometimes a kind of on the nose sense of humor, but in season 3 it really got ramped up where they had like the shopping mall and they were introducing the Soviet Union as the bad guys, and they did the whole never-ending story sing-along thing. It just got a bit much. And I like camp, but like I also liked Stranger Things where it took itself a bit more seriously. Season 4 feels like a nice slide back in that direction. You've got Vecna, who's this new villain who introduces a whole new element to the villains on the show, who have up until this moment been either creatures or unknowable Lovecraft entities beyond our understanding. Vecna for the first time is a villain who is intelligent and is sort of on a more of a human level, which allows him to play off the other characters, the heroes, in more interesting ways than we've seen. It feels darker than season 3. It feels like it's a bit more, I say grounded, but we're still talking about like extraterrestrial, interdimensional demons. But I think Vecna's an interesting introduction to the show, who plays into other characters' backstories in interesting ways, and there are twists and reveals that work, especially, you know, the end of the season where Vecna is revealed to be like number 1, and how he plays into Eleven's whole backstory. That works as a twist, you know. The character development is really good in this season. Sadie Sink obviously carries the first half of the season as Max, which is amazing for a character that I, up until this point, didn't particularly care for necessarily, just because she was introduced in season 2 and always felt like an addition. I really liked her in this season. Eleven is obviously the most important character still on the show, but like the whole crew of Nancy and Robin, Steve, Lucas and Dustin all work really well. They all bounce off each other really well. Eddie is a great addition to the show. The football jock who leads like the hunt for Eddie is a very good hateable character, the sort of character you love to hate. Even Chrissy, who was only in like an episode or something, left a really strong impact. So that's one of the things the show continues to do really well, and part of what makes it worth watching. It hasn't entirely shaken some of its issues though. The cast still feels massively bloated, which is, you know, when I'm talking about them introducing so many good characters, yes, but on the other hand, the more development, the more screen time you give to some, it has to be sacrificed elsewhere. So while it's amazing what they've done with Max this season, it does really feel like Mike and Jonathan have been demoted. Like if Robin or Lucas are like secondary characters in this season, Mike and Jonathan feel like tertiary characters. They don't even feel like the support characters, they're just kind of there. And Will has sort of always had this problem, still feels really underdeveloped in comparison to everyone else, still feels like he's playing catch up with everyone else on the show. And like the most memorable part of their group was probably Argyle, who is another new character who they've introduced, and it just, you know what I mean? It feels like the cast is exceptionally bloated at this stage. And that's without mentioning Hopper or Joyce or Murray and their whole pretty much entirely separate storyline to everyone else, where they go to Siberia and try and break Hopper out of a gulag. And my issue with the whole Soviet element is that it just feels like a storyline too far. In a narrative that already has like so many things going on, having characters go off to the other side of the world and just take on like a hostile foreign military that isn't actually integral to the main storyline, it feels completely out of sync with the show's, you know, mystery, small haunted town vibe. And that's sort of the symptom of season 3 with its 80s overindulgence, introducing Russian antagonists because, you know, 80s. But now that season 4 is going back to the show's roots, it all really feels kind of out of place. Like Hopper probably shouldn't have been abducted by the Russians. He could have been held in like a US facility, like an Area 51 kind of thing. And when they're reintroducing Brenner and his lab and the conflict within the US between him and the military, if Hopper was locked up by the military, that would bring his storyline closer to Eleven's, and that would have been more synchronized than having Joyce and Murray fly to fucking Siberia of all places. Like if he was locked up in Nevada and they went to another state, that sort of I don't know, it sort of reins the story in, feels like it's a little bit more under control. and like I said, could have tied together Brenner versus the military storyline by having Hopper locked up by the US. I just feel like that would have been a neater way of handling these sort of disparate storylines in a way that's less disconnected. And it also feels like the show's still better at setting up plot points than it is resolving them, which has been an issue since season 1, to be honest. But it's good. It's really good at drawing you in, like drawing the audience in with all these mysteries and everything that's happening, all these unexplainable things that are happening. But the resolutions tend to still feel kind of contrived. Like, I feel like there's too many scenes where there's a character positing some sort of solution that ends up being like the 1 in a million shot that just happens to work. But with those sort of nitpicks and criticisms out of the way, the strengths of season 4 of Stranger Things definitely outweighs the weaknesses. When Vecna as a new antagonist and the threats that he poses, the tensions between like all the different forces and factions within the story, deepening the characters' histories and backstories, twists, revelations, and like the banter which the show has always been able to rely on. They've got a sort of reinvigoration of the show in my eyes. Like, I'm back from someone who would just watch this show when there was nothing else on to someone who is actually excited to see where the story goes and I think how it wraps up. I think the next 2 episodes that are going to be released in whenever is it. So I'm kind of glad to see the show rise back up to prominence, and I feel close to where it should have been after its first season, and I'm excited to see where things go from here. So, like, up front, the main thing to get across about Narcos Mexico Season 3 is that it is fundamentally a solid, well-made, entertaining show that brings together and closes up the whole 6 seasons of the Narcos franchise, probably 5 or 6 years too late. Like, this is more about Narcos in general, but it feels like the show didn't really know what its purpose was beyond its first 2 seasons. Seasons 1 and 2 have a very clearly defined, it's about the rise and fall of Pablo Escobar. It's a self-contained narrative covering a specific time and place. It explains how one man amassed so much wealth and so much power and so much prestige, and then how internal and external enemies work together to bring him down, right? And really about what the legacy of that is on Colombia, and extrapolating that to talk about like the war on drugs, rise of the narco cartel, international supply and demand of cocaine and other drugs, etc, etc, etc. And the show really accomplishes that in seasons 1 and 2. By the time that Pablo Escobar has been dealt with, it's got all those messages across. You as a viewer get where the show is going, right? You get what the show is trying to tell you. And then it continued for another 4 seasons, kind of doing the same thing without any real strategy, it almost feels like, without any real vision or destination of where the show really wanted to go. It just continued to exist. Like, seasons 1 and 2 tell you all about like why there's so much violence and the corruption of police and politicians, always succumbing to the obscene amounts of money that these cartels have, and why that's still an issue today. And Narcos could have bowed out pretty gracefully after its 2nd season, but instead they carried on the show, and yeah, there might still be a lot of intrigue and a lot of interest and a story to tell about the balance of power moving to Mexico, and all these like internal politics of all these different organizations, and I get, how they corrupt the government and the media and the police, and how that crosses the border into the US, and why the war on drugs is this ongoing thing that's really complicated and can't really be won. But yes, we got all that from the first 2 seasons. If the intention of Narcos as a show is to just inform me about all the details and the minutiae of the international history of cartels, make a documentary, right? There's no need for it to be this elaborate, high-budget dramatization of something that doesn't really have, or doesn't feel like it has, any destination or plan. Like, there has to be more to it than just telling me how Kingpin A was deposed by Kingpin B. And to give like a specific example of the problem of Narcos getting bogged down in all the little details, this series that I've just watched ends signaling the rise of El Chapo to the apex of the cartel world. The problem with that is that they were already beaten in that story by all of their imitators and competitors about 6 years ago. Like, when Narcos was like establishing itself in 2015, 2016, that's when El Chapo was in the news for breaking out of prison and escaping prison, then being recaptured. And all these production agencies and all these companies that were in like South America and Mesoamerica were looking at the massive success that Narcos was having on Netflix, telling a story about Escobar, the biggest drugs kingpin, and all thought, hey, who else can we make a story about? This guy's in the news, let's do the story of El Chapo. And there's like, I mean, on Netflix there's probably like half a dozen series, miniseries, movies, documentaries about El Chapo that came out 6 years ago or so when Narcos was having its first big hit. So for it to take this long to catch up to the rest of them, sort of be beaten to the punch by all their imitators and all the people who were just like opportunistically trying to jump on the Narcos trend, it sort of speaks volumes about how bogged down in the details this show was. Like, Escobar died in season 2, right? That came out in 2016. And at the end of this season that came out in 2021, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was killed. So that's a real life gap of 5 years. But in real life, when these two people were killed, there was only 4 years apart. So the show is taking literally longer than real life to tell the story of these cartels. And when you compare it to like another historical series on Netflix like The Crown, where they're basically squishing an entire decade into each season, I'm not saying it needs to pick up the pace or adopt that sort of speed of adaptation like The Crown is, but you're doing something wrong when you are taking longer than real life to tell a story that happened. Like, when you're taking 5 years to tell a story that is 4 years long, you've got to look at it and think, like, is this show really taking the right approach with adapting this story, or is it just like, here's literally every little detail of everything? And I'm not saying it's bad or it's not entertaining, but it just sort of exacerbates this feeling that the show is directionless, like aimless. It's just existing for its own sake and telling stories for the sake of telling them. And it's a weird state for a show that was at one point like putting out some of the best drama you could see on TV. It's a weird way for the show to sort of crawl to its finale, to its ending. Like, it's I can't think of a show that goes out more with a whimper than a bang than the way that Narcos ended, because it doesn't even get to Chapo. It doesn't even get to El Chapo. It gets to him amassing power but not actually becoming the big kingpin himself. So I don't know, like, obviously the show will always have those first 2 seasons about Escobar. It will always have some sort of legacy in terms of widening Netflix's catalogue of non-English language dramas, particularly its Spanish speaking dramas. So the show definitely has its place in history, but like, I don't know, man, it's just a sort of sad, whimperish way for the show to go out. Like, it existed for this long. It almost feels like because Netflix forgot to cancel it, and I mean, and that's additionally exacerbated by how many characters it's gone through. Like, obviously, yeah, a lot of these characters went off the show because they died, but a lot of them left the show because the actors didn't want to come back after 2 seasons. So you got this revolving door, which again, like other factors, just exacerbates this sort of aimlessness of the show, where it's not really about anyone or any place or anything in particular other than hammering home the point that yes, the war on drugs is pointless and a waste of resources, and it's too complicated to ever win. But like, I don't know, it just feels like there should have been more to a show that went on for this long and got that point across umpteen times over its run. I don't know, like, right, it's done. We're moving on from Narcos. Watch the first 2 seasons of that show, and then if you need to feel like you need to watch season 3, do that. But I don't know. Narcos Mexico just doesn't feel like it needed to exist to me, regardless of how quality it is in terms of it's acting and it's how it presents itself, the whole presentation. Even the writing within the seasons isn't bad. It's just like when you take the thing as a whole, I don't really know what the point of this show was. So Inside Job is a adult animated comedy from Netflix. It's a workplace sitcom set in a shadowy corporation who control the world through conspiracy theories. And all the conspiracy theories that you've heard of are basically true. So like reptilians, Illuminati, not flat Earth, but hollow Earth, right? It's a show created by Shion Takeuchi, who worked on Gravity Falls. Alex Hirsch, creator of Gravity Falls, is also on the show as a producer. And it's fair to say that the show has a lot of that DNA in it. It has a lot of Hersheyisms in its comedy, and I feel like this is going to be the part of the video where most people disagree with me. This show is not very funny, and that's probably one of the worst sins that a comedy can make. The jokes feel really obvious. They all feel like very safe jokes that a comedy coming out in 2021, 2022, coming out this decade, this period of time would make. Like, it doesn't feel like it's pushing the envelope in any ways. The jokes, like I said, have a lot of that Gravity Falls style to them, and Gravity Falls is a funny show. So what I think the difference is that, like, when Gravity Falls is a show that's on the Disney Channel and it feels like it's pushing the envelope, where it's making some sort of reference or some sort of joke that's a bit dark or a bit more mature or a bit more risque than you would expect to be on a kids show, that's pushing the envelope. That's in the context of it being a kids show, that's pretty funny. And it's that whole thing about straddling the line of a joke that kids can get, but the audience, but the adults who are watching, the parents who are watching, can also find humor in as well. When you take that style of humor and put it into a show that's aimed at adults, it isn't operating under the same context. It's not pushing the same envelope, because there isn't an expectation for it to not make jokes like that. The state of adult animated comedies being what they are already saturated with crass humor and celebrity references, right? So when you're making that kind of joke in Inside Job, it's not pushing against some sort of restriction or some sort of context or barrier that it is with a kids show. You're not making a celebrity reference, you're not making a risque joke, you're not making something, a bit of crass gag that you wouldn't expect to see on a kids show. You're just making celebrity reference humor or a crass gag, right? And as for what those jokes are on Inside Job, they always feel like the most obvious joke that can be made in any sort of situation, any sort of scenario, which is a disappointment, because like, conspiracy theories are so wacky that they should be brilliant sort of subject matter to create a lot of comedy. But because the jokes are so obvious in this show, because they're so straightforward, they're so basic, it feels like I've heard them all before, right? So they do, like, there's an episode where basically one of the recurring gags is that flat earthers are dumb, right? Which is fine subject matter for when, YouTube and Reddit and Twitter were doing all these gags about flat earthers 2-3 years ago, and they were ragging on, flat earthers was basically a meme at that point. When you're coming out with a show in 2021 and all the jokes are basically feel like they could have been lifted from Twitter or lifted from upvoted Reddit comments, it just feels kind of lame, like these jokes have already been done. It's already a little bit passé, and the jokes that you're putting out in your show are like of a higher caliber than internet comments, right? It's also like kind of bottom of the barrel observational humor that I think anyone could make about conspiracy theories like reptilian elites or the moon landing or the JFK assassination. It's the same crackpot theories that you've heard. Oh, haha, isn't Mark Zuckerberg like a weird, awkward guy? What if he was a reptoid? Funny. And if it isn't making like the most obvious jokes it can about conspiracy theories, it's making pop culture references out the wazoo. Not as many as like the worst offenders, but a lot, like too many for me to, really praise the humor here. Or it's making use of its extremely one-dimensional supporting characters like Merca General or Sex Alien or Drug Scientist. These aren't characters, these are one joke that you have given a character design. This isn't character-based humor, this is like gag-based humor, like talk show, late night talk show gag humor, Jimmy Kimmel kind of level of things. It's not good enough, it's not funny enough. If it is any of those things, it also has a tendency to fall back on the bro dog frat boy kind of humor, which, and again, we sort of go back to the whole context of like kid show versus adult animation. Like when regular show was doing the frat boy stoner humor sort of thing on Cartoon Network 13 years ago, it was pretty funny because we hadn't seen that sort of thing, especially not on a kids network, right? That was the envelope it was pushing against. That was context of what made it funny. When you're doing that nearly, a decade and a half later on what is supposed to be an adult animated comedy, it's not going to have the same effect when the characters just sort of fall back on that, when you don't have any other jokes to make. They just go, "Whoa, dog, what up, dog? Whoa, let's get crunk." It's like, really? In 2021, that's the best you've got? Like, I saw people praising this show because the characters weren't obviously hideous, but like, it's not like they actually look good either. Like, is that all an adult animated comedy has to be? Like, it doesn't look aggressively ugly. And all this, talking about the comedy, talking about the styles of humor, it all feels like a huge waste of a concept of having a show around conspiracy theories as like the foundation of the show and the foundation of like where the humor is coming from, because it never takes advantage of how completely absurd, how weird you could get with that humor. I know the obvious point of reference here is like Rick and Morty, because the show's been compared to Rick and Morty a lot, but I feel like you look at the Cronenberg episode of Rick and Morty where they end that episode on Rick and Morty replacing the version of themselves from the universe they end in because they fucked up their own universe so much that everybody turned into this body horror creature and died, and like, that's pretty messed up, and that's a dark joke and sort of shocking. You didn't really expect the show to go that far. And when you're making a comedy about conspiracy theories, and Lord knows we all sat through like those Wendigoon conspiracy theory iceberg videos, we know that conspiracy theories can get pretty fucking wacky, right? They can get weird, they can get pretty dark and disturbing. So for this show to go like its entire season without taking advantage of that, without getting like really absurd with some of the jokes, instead just making haha Oprah Winfrey in the Illuminati or whatever they were making jokes about. The whole episode about James Bond, I'm like, why is there an episode about a James Bond parody in a show that's supposed to be about conspiracy theories? Why is there an episode about 1980s nostalgia in a show that's supposed to be about conspiracy theories? And the James Bond episode ending on like the point being made at the end, and I know there's more going on with like the characters, whatever, but the strong joke that they end on, the strong point that they end on, is that retro James Bond is kind of misogynist. That's your hot take? that's what you want to end the episode on? Just seems really weak and not really tying things together. So like the 1980s episode where Ridley, it's established her dad was manipulating her and didn't let her engage in pop culture so she doesn't get any of the 80s references that everyone else is making. Okay, fine. You set that up as part of your character's backstory. That's like the one bit of continuity that runs through the series mainly. But like an episode later, there's a flashback where she was trying to recreate the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as a kid by exposing turtles to radiation. And again, the whole point of that scene is her dad knocking down her confidence and calling her stupid because the experiment goes wrong. It's tying into how her dad has manipulated her whole life, right? But you established in one episode that she doesn't know anything about the 80s, and then she's trying to recreate the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So if these were just throwaway jokes that didn't mean anything, I would sort of brush it off as like a little bit of an inconsistency. But this is basically the one storyline that runs through the series, is Ridley recognizing that her dad was manipulating her whole life, and you still can't even be consistent with that. It's just, the show just feels sloppy in both its humor and the bits of writing that it's trying to build something narratively with. It all feels just a bit lazy and a bit sloppy, and it's not terrible insofar as like there's some things at work that, like, Ridley and Brett's relationship is pretty good. Like, there's two main characters, they're definitely more dynamic. They have a bit more about them than all the rest of the characters, who are pretty much universally kind of crap, but it's not enough to rescue the show for me. I was really honestly disappointed with Inside Job, especially with it sort of having a lot of that Gravity Falls DNA, when other shows, like I mentioned up at the top of the video, Owl House and Amphibia, I've been impressed by. This was an opportunity to do something like that with aimed at an adult audience, but if there's one thing that a comedy has to be, it has to be funny. And my god, did the humor in this show, the style of comedy in this show, leave me absolutely stone-faced. Just a big disappointment for me all around. Although I recognize that I am massively in the minority on that one. There's already a big fandom for Inside Job, and it's had very good reception, so maybe don't listen to me entirely, but I cannot recommend this one. On a slightly happier note is ToraDora, which is a 2008 high school romance comedy love pentagon anime that I watched because I'm trying to go through Mario Kart's back catalogue. Started with Makia, which I made a video on, go watch it. And I also watched Anohana earlier this year. And I would actually say Anohana's the better show compared to ToraDora, but still, ToraDora might be the most pure fun I've had with a show in a long time, right? It's about these two main characters, Ryuji and Taiga, who have a crush on each other's friends. So Ryuji has a friend called Kitamura, who Taiga is crushing on. Taiga has a friend called Kushieda, who Ryuji is crushing on. He is this diligent, hardworking house husband, sort of domestic god kind of guy, but everybody has a negative opinion of him, like thinks he's some sort of delinquent because he has this scary face, right? She is this short girl with an even shorter temper, comes from a rich family, is completely aloof and acts like she's above everyone, but has no common sense and has no idea how to look after herself. These two outcasts who nobody else really wants to deal with team up to decide to help the other one out with their crush. And it's very obvious what the trajectory of the story is going to be, because it becomes immediately apparent how well these two main characters complement each other, and you can see straight from the off that it's going to end up with them together. But while we can see that, and pretty much everyone around them can see that, they're too dense to realize it itself until inevitably the last part of the story. So it's obviously, it's got a very typical high school romance set up to the story and the characters. But the reason that I think this works is partly because the characters are all so distinctive with their personalities that they play off well against each other in almost any situation, whether that's going into the romantic elements of the story or the comedic elements of the story. And there is a lot of comedy in this show. And the reason why they're all so distinct in their personalities is because each one of them has several layers that you need to peel away throughout the course of the show before you can really get to know them. And none of that is particularly unique to this show, but it's just very well crafted here. Like, this was a show written by and made by people who know how to tell a story. And so while you've got, the whole thing about like Ryuji and Taiga helping each other with their respective crushes. Then Ami Kawashima has entered into the show, and she's this catalyst for stirring up mostly the other female characters. First, she starts stirring up Taiga, challenging her a little bit for Ryuji's attention, because it becomes apparent that Ami Kawashima has a crush on Ryuji, and she's really the only character that can operate on Taiga's level of aloofness and get under her skin and really wind her up and push those two together in a way, or to open up to their feelings a little bit more. And then once she's done with that, she's immediately onto Kushieda and challenging her and winding her up and pushing her crush and like her feelings on Ryuji and everything. So she's a great character. She just absolutely comes in and does everything that she needs to do, and her coming in and being that catalyst to stir up the other characters and to progress certain plot lines that weren't going to progress on their own in a vacuum shows how much the writers understand about what the show needs and can just drop what it needs in. And that's obviously, you know, a very good skill set to have as a writer. And I think that's the main thing that I take away from this, is just how much fun it was to see these characters interact in pretty much any situation, and how each 22-minute episode does just enough in each of the departments. There's just enough character development, there's just enough playing into the romance, there's just enough drama, just enough comedy for every episode to do enough to entertain and to tempt you into watching the next one. But it never really like oversteps into that melodrama. It never really challenges the audience. It's just a good, entertaining story, even if it really doesn't have that much to say about anything. It does a very good job at entertaining. Ryuji, there's a continuing thread throughout the story of Ryuji as part of his, being a very good domestic house husbandy type, that he puts together these really well packaged bento meals for Taiga. And honestly, that's what every episode feels like. It just feels like this perfectly well balanced little package of entertainment that you can come home every day to and just put on 2 or 3 episodes and feel fulfilled by them without feeling challenged. Like I say, this isn't a deep story particularly, even though the characters each is coming with their own personal baggage and their own personal backstory. It's not really trying to say that much, and it's definitely not trying to subvert or surprise in any way. It's a very straight told romantic comedy, but it's just an example of a story that's told very well. And that's what I'm finding with a lot of Mari Okada's work, is that she knows how to write a story. And I'm not giving her full credit for this show, because she was the head writer, but she wasn't the showrunner or anything, and this story was based on a pre-existing manga. So I'm not trying to give the idea that this is like the Mari Okada show in the same, or the story in the same way that Makia or Anohana was. But I just really enjoyed ToraDora, and there's a reason why, God, is it like a decade and a half after it was released that people are still talking about it, because it's just a damn good, entertaining bit of TV. Orbital Children, I'm not going to have a lot to say about it, because this is one of the first shows I watched out on this whole list, and I remember very little about it. It's only 6 episodes long, and I think there were, even in its first episode, some red flags about this show, just these aren't very good signs. So, alright, let's get into the premise quickly. It's a show set on a space station where the first boy and girl who were born in space live, as well as some other characters who are scientists and astronauts and whatever. And these other kids from Earth go up to meet these, they won a competition to go up to the space station and meet the orbital kids who live up there. And there were some warning signs right out of the gate when, in the first episode, a meteor strikes the space station, and we never see it. They never show the meteor hitting the space station to the audience. We just get everyone's reactions to it, which seemed like the weirdest way they could have displayed that part of the story. I don't know why they chose not to show that. And then shortly after that, one of the kids, there's 3 kids who go up to the space station. One of the kids is this social media girl, live streamer, who's always just streaming from her phone every part of her life. and her little brother is going up with her, who is sort of a fanboy of the kid that was born in space, the main character. And then there's this third character, this other boy, doesn't say anything. And then when they get up to the space station, he still doesn't say anything. He might have like one line of dialogue. And then after the meteor crashes into space station, suddenly he does this big reveal where he is this space cop and he's after the robot owned by the boy born in space because his robot is illegal. So he's been sent up on behalf of the space cops to arrest him. He has his own robot and his robot fights the space boy's robot. But instead of it being a fight, they just flash lights at each other in sort of like Morse code because they're trying to hack each other, and that's how hacking between these robots works. And I say robots, I mean they're just like boxes made of metal, and the show is trying to play it off like it's a laser fight, but there's no peril, there's no tension between any of the people around this, the other kids that are around this, because there's no threat to them. They're not actually shooting lasers, they're not actually fighting, they're just trying to hack each other. And like that coming so soon after this character's reveal, which isn't a reveal because they didn't establish this character at all anyway. He was just there sort of in the background. He was like fucking NPC, and then all of a sudden he goes, actually I'm working for the cops and I've come to put an end to you. Our robots will now flash lights at each other. So all that, which was just two terrible sequences back to back, coming again straight after the meteor that we didn't even see. After the first episode, I was like, "Oh God, I'm already sort of checked out of this one." The story doesn't necessarily get any better or any worse from there. It just sort of chugs along. You get a bit more information about the characters, I guess. There's this whole thing about this cult that worships this AI, and there's basically the themes of the story are around like predetermination and free will. But it does very little in the way of actually getting us to care about this setting or the characters or connecting those themes in any sort of meaningful way to its story. It just, sometimes people talk about free will and determination, and there is this AI on a comet that's coming back and like it's connected to the meteor or whatever, but it just comes across as like a lot of anime deep philosophical horse shit, to be honest. And I would give this one a miss. I mean, to the show's credit, it's only 6 episodes long, so like that's a virtue in some ways. But yeah, Orbital Children might be the worst show on this list. Words Bubble Up Like Soda Pop and Bubble are two teen romance anime movies featuring male protagonists who wear headphones in order to isolate themselves from the world, and both have bubble in the title, so naturally it only makes sense to pair them together. Words Bubble Up Like Soda Pop was the first one of these I watched, and it is a good movie. It's very charming, it's very sweet. It's set in this small, sleepy sort of city that is big enough to have a shopping mall, shopping centre, but not really anything else going on in the town. The main boy is reclusive, he writes haikus, he helps out and volunteers working with the elderly, and like I said, has these headphones that he puts on to isolate himself from those around him, to sort of like close himself off from the rest of the world. There's a lot of the movie that is relating to haikus, which I've got to admit is it's an art form that's somewhat lost on me, so there might be a lot of this the context and a lot of the subtext in the movie that I don't really get, but it didn't impact my enjoyment of this movie. I still really liked it. The main boy's mum is injured and he's like helping out at this elder care thing in the shopping centre. His family is planning to move away and he can't really express himself. He's got these hang-ups about moving away. The other main character is obviously the female lead. She is a live streamer who is self-conscious about her appearance because she's got she's buck-toothed, and she always wears a mask to so that her viewers can never really see her face, and she's just lacking in confidence about that. So you got these two characters with pretty relatable grounded issues the two literally like crash into each other at the shopping center, and it's from there it's just a tale of them getting to know each other, working through their insecurities with each other, sort of being encouraged by the other's presence. It's just a very sweet, grounded anime movie. It's got like a nice distinctive art style with like strong use of vibrant colors. Both characters are sort of like hiding away from other people in their own way, and this is showing them, you know, how they grow and gain confidence about themselves and about each other. There's this sweet sort of tie-in story which ends up tying into like the main narrative about the old man who the boy is helping. He used to run a record store, and he produced an album for his wife because his wife was a singer, and he's trying to find that vinyl record again so that you can hear her voice one last time. That pulls his friends in helping her, and his friends to help the search, and her friends to help the search, and they team up with like the old man's like descendants, his family, and there's this whole thing about them like wanting to play that record at the summer Shinto festival rather than the traditional music. It's all just like it ties together. It's a nice, small, low-key, grounded movie about people discovering strengths through each other while trying to do something nice for an old man. And I don't think you need much more than that. I would absolutely recommend this one. It's not too long, just a nice little story that I don't think many people saw it. I haven't really seen this movie being talked about, so give it a watch. Well worth it. Bubble, on the other hand, is also, like I said, a teen romance anime movie with Bubble in the title that asks the question, can love blossom between a socially reclusive parkour prodigy and the sentient alien Bubble who killed his parents? Find out. In this one, Tokyo has been flooded by this mysterious bubble that appeared one day, and nature has reclaimed most of the city. The main character enters the bubble to compete in these like cool parkour tournaments that they have in the ruined city, and that shit rocks. Like, there's some great sequences, these great action chase sequences as they're running through, jumping over like debris and rubble, leaping across these ruined skyscrapers. That's fantastic. I love that shit. I definitely feel the story should have been, if not all that, for like an hour and a half. It should have featured a lot more, because that was easily the best part of the film. Unfortunately, there are other things going on that are less successful. The budget for this movie must have been like pretty insane just because of how amazingly visually it looks. But when it comes to the writing and the characters, it falls down a little bit. So the main character, like I said, talented parkourist, wears headphones because has got hypersensitivity of, you know, his hearing, sort of triggered by the noise of Tokyo, the new Tokyo that's been built, and the hustle and bustle of the city. One day he drowns for some reason, and I can't remember exactly why, but he gets saved by this like mysterious girl who's the female lead character, who appears in his life one day and is completely besotted with him for reason, and she is the most designed by committee, textbook manic pixie dream girl anime waifu that has ever been committed to film. Yeah, she has this like, she's like this naive cat girl for some reason who eats like a barbarian and dresses like a clown and just follows the main character around with like big doe eyes and doesn't talk. It's just like pandering to the extreme, and it's that uncanny valley where she's a character who's supposed to be like super appealing, I assume, to the male audience, but like isn't, because she's so uncannily everything that's boring and really annoying about like crappy female romantic interests. The movie, with its fantasy elements and its teen romance elements, and the fact that they spent like an amazing amount on the visuals, which do look incredible, but you get the sense that this definitely wants to be a Makoto Shinkai movie, and how poorly it falls down in terms of the characters and the chemistry. There's just zero chemistry between the main characters. give you an appreciation of what Shinkai does, even in, I say, a lesser film like Weathering With You, but Weathering With You was still like really good. It shows that even in a film like that, how much goes right, how much goes into making this film, a film like that, work, that just does not with this one. Like I say, when it's going into the visuals, it's going into these parkour chase sequences, which I think there's about 3 of in the movie. It speaks volumes to how much better the movie is when all the characters like just shut up and they're running up and down these buildings, doing backflips, jumping off ledges. That, you know, that's fun because it's just exciting and it's well choreographed and it's well animated. Action sequences, very much of like the pod racing ilk in episode 1, where it's like, this movie is incredibly boring, dull, I don't want to watch this. Oh, pod racing, that's fun. And then it's just back to nothing. Like I said, main characters have like no chemistry. I think the best way to watch this film might be like with the audio off, so you can just make up your own story with these incredible, gorgeous visuals. And yeah, it goes into that whole like melodramatic ending that just doesn't stick because you've been watching this film and you just don't care about the characters or their investment in each other or anything, their relationship, anything. You just don't care. So the big melodramatic ending doesn't stick. The takeaway from this is basically, if you're going to watch one teenage romance anime movie featuring a main character who wears headphones to isolate himself from the outside world, that has bubble in the title, watch Words Bubble Up Like Soda Pop, because that is, by some measure, the better film. And the last show that I want to talk about is Derry Girls, which just wrapped up its 3rd and final season. And just what a good show, what a great comedy that really is. Like, you know, when people talk about how there's no old-fashioned sitcoms anymore, they just don't make comedy like they used to anymore. This is what Derry Girls is. It is a well-oiled, well-constructed, old-fashioned sitcom that is just funny because it has characters with distinct personalities and puts them in silly but relatable situations and finds the comedy from their interactions and how they bounce off each other. You've got Erin, who paints herself as a believer and an activist, but is fairly vain and only really interested in how virtuous it can make her appear to others. And she's a great comedic main character because she already sees herself as a main character in real life anyway. You've got Claire, who is the smart member of the group, the reasonable, responsible member of the group who tries to rein in the others, but then throws them all under the bus at the first sign of authority or like any sign of repercussion. She just rats everyone out instantly. Michelle, who is the troublemaker of the gang, and you know, like where Claire's flaws are her eagerness to throw everyone under the bus, and Erin, her flaws are like how vain and self-centered she can be at times. Michelle's maybe the most straightforward because her flaws are so upfront. She is into boys, she is into getting completely wasted, and she is into going to parties and doing drugs and just anything that she knows is bad she's into. Orla, who is almost always completely detached from reality and totally spaced out, never seems to grasp the full extent of any situation, which leads to her getting the wrong end of the stick and tends to go on like these complete non sequiturs. And then you've got James, who is Michelle's cousin, who moves to Derry from London at the start of the series and is put into the girls' school because everyone's scared of what would happen to him if he was put in with the boys. He's soft and kind of squeamish and weak. Everybody just assumes that he's gay, and he tends to be the butt of the joke. But also on the other side, he's more often than not the most rational, normal member of the group and has the reaction that I think most of the audience would have, which doesn't help him because despite him being rational, most of the situations and most of the people around him are completely irrational. Like, all the characters have these different, distinct personalities and they bring a different flavour of comedy to whatever scenario they're put into. And it's not just that they are one-joke characters, one-note characters that have their gag. They are personalities, which gives them more flexibility and makes the comedy not gag-driven, but character-driven, which I think in the long run for any sort of show like this is definitely preferable. And because the show is essentially fundamentally about growing up as an awkward teenager. There are plenty of these scenarios that they can be thrown into, and just let them bounce around and see what jokes arise from that. And that's all before you get into like the backdrop of the show and how it's set in Northern Ireland during a politically fraught period of history where bombings and terrorism were a everyday threat that these characters have to live with. Ultimately, I think that's what the show's legacy is going to be, about how it found humour and warmth from such a difficult moment of history with difficult topics to talk about. That's where it's going to get all the praise, and I think that's what it's going to be remembered for. And you know, I studied the Troubles at A level, and given the average Brit's understanding of that topic, probably makes me one of the country's preeminent scholars on the matter. So I get the gravity of putting a comedy in, you know, such a difficult period. But what I want to highlight and discuss is that really Derry Girls only really works because fundamentally, when you strip all that away, it is a well-constructed, universal comedy that works in, like I said, an old-fashioned way by just having these characters that can bounce off each other in really funny ways. And the reason I want to get that across is because I think there's a hesitancy among people who, when they hear about a comedy that is praised for things other than being funny, to avoid it. Like, a sitcom that's set during the Troubles in Northern Ireland won't be the easiest sell to someone who is either unfamiliar with the decade because it's set in the early 90s, or isn't familiar with the culture or the history or the politics, or maybe just doesn't really have any sort of interest in learning about that sort of thing or being exposed to that sort of thing. So I think it's important to put this forward, is that the show works because it's funny, and you could set this in Los Angeles, or you could set this in Sydney or Jakarta, I don't know, and like 90% of the jokes would still work. Yes, the further you get out from Northern Ireland, there's going to be some jokes that you don't get, and the further you live away from that, you're going to get less and less. But it's, like I said, there's a solid, vast majority of the gags work because it's a show that is about growing up as a teenager and the awkwardness of that first, and then all the political stuff, all the historical stuff is just like a bonus on top. Like, yes, the show is intrinsically linked to the time and place that it's set, but none of that would work if the show wasn't about that sort of universal comedy of being a teenager. And I think specifically the third season of the show is a really good place to wrap things up. Obviously, because like any show that's set with school kids has, like, you know, a finite life, but it does enough to suggest like what the future of these characters might look like without setting anything in stone. So you got things like, oh, Erin and James might get together, but nothing's confirmed. Michelle is having to, you know, deal with her brother getting out of prison. Claire leaves Derry to go and study and further her education, and also is coming out as gay. Orla, she did a dance number. They didn't really give Orla anything, but I think the show does a decent enough job of wrapping everything up. You get to the Good Friday Agreement, there's a general sense of optimism and hope around everyone, and they set the characters off. You know, this is where our story with them ends, and I think it does all that while being this hilarious celebration of everything that the show does right. And I don't know what more you could really want from a sitcom, you know, besides more episodes with Uncle Colm, because he is fucking hilarious. So yeah, that wraps up this wrap up of what I'd been watching over the last, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. Let me know what you thought down below in the comments. Did this video work? Did you enjoy it? Were there any things in this list that you had seen? And if so, did you agree? Did you disagree? Was there anything you haven't seen that you heard about here or were interested in seeing? And are you still interested in seeing them? And yeah, what have you been watching? Because I'm always on the lookout for new things to watch. So it'd be interesting to get some feedback from people to see, you know, what the people who watch this video are into. And about Amphibia and Alos that we started on, yes, I am planning a video of which they will be a part, so by all means discuss those as well and let me know your thoughts. And until next time, thanks.